Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Today we'll be doing the instructions course on imaging in diabetic retinopathy. We know that diabetic retinopathy has got a long subclinical course. So, but just by doing a clinical examination, probably we miss many of the clinical findings in diabetic retinopathy. So, imaging carries a lot of relevance in diabetic retinopathy. So, today we have got six eminent co-instructors along with me. We will be talking on various topics on imaging in diabetic retinopathy. And I'll be introducing the speakers just before their talks. And let's move on to the first talk. The first talk will be by Dr. Manish Bapai. Dr. Manish Bapai heads the Bapai Hospital in Nashik, Maharashtra. He's an excellent vitreoretinal surgeon and has got a good academic background. He has published many articles. He has done a lot of co-instruction and instruction courses also in various national and international forums. Over to you, Manish, for your talk on FA and ultrafield FFA and diabetic retinopathy. You can start sharing your screen, Manish.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I'll be talking about importance of fluorescein angiography in diabetic retinopathy. Is my screen visible, Dr. Sunil?
Yeah, I can. Now it's visible. Please go ahead.
Okay. So fluorescein angiography is one of the most important investigations that is available for assessment of diabetic retinopathy, and in fact, it was one of the first investigation which was studied in depth when it came to management of diabetic retinopathy. Fluorescein angiography by itself has, in a way, changed significantly, and in a way, not changed since 1959 when Novotny and Alvin described use of fluorescein in assessment of retinal, in retinal angiography. The basic principles of the procedure still remain the same. One second. Yeah, so the basic principles of injection still remain the same. Fluorescein dye is injected, which is then stimulated by passing the light through excitation filter, and the reflected emitted energy is captured on the film using the barrier filter. The excitation energy is 460 nanometers, while emission is in green spectrum of 515 nanometers. The dye tends to remain, doesn't cross the blood retinal barrier. That's why it tends to remain in the within the intravascular compartment and in the choroid. Does not leak through the choroid through the RP tight junctions. So it gives us good view of the retinal vasculature, but not suitable for choroidal imaging. We all know about various phases of fluorescein angiography, so I'll skip that and let us go to commonly seen lesions in diabetic lesions on fluorescein angiography. They are the most common ones: microaneurysms and intraretinal hemorrhages, which may be difficult to detect or separate in clinical examination. But the microaneurysms are localized capillary dilatation, which appear as small hyperfluorescent dots, while the intraretinal hemorrhages, which may be dot or blotch shaped or flame shaped depending on their depth in the retina, they appear as hypofluorescent spots. The hard exudates, they are extracellular lipid leaked. It is often associated with retinal edema and may be available in the form of clumps or circinates around the cluster of microaneurysms. Principally, they are seen in macular region, and then they form plaque in macular lesion in late stages, which affects the vision of the patient. They appear as hypofluorescent spots, while the plaques, they tend to stain in late stages and appear as hyperfluorescent. The capillary non-perfusion areas, they appear as hypofluorescent lesion in the mid-peripheral retina. They are usually surrounded by, these are islands of hypofluorescence surrounded by sea of the normal capillary hyperfluorescent capillary networks. The intraretinal microvascular anomaly, or IRMA, appears in areas of capillary dilatation and intraretinal new vessel formation. They appear as hyperfluorescent lesions, as we can see in the area where the arrows are there. They, unlike neovascularizations, they do not leak. Venous beading changes, they appear in later stages of the diabetic retinopathy, and beading is a sign which is suggestive of diffuse retinal ischemia, as can be seen in this particular angiogram. The neovascularization elsewhere, neovascularization anywhere is a progressive ischemia which leads to development of anomalous vessels on the retinal surface, and they appear as grossly hyperfluorescent due to leakage of dye. If that happens on the retinal elsewhere other than the optic nerve head and 1 disc diameter away from it, it's called as neovascularization elsewhere. While at the optic nerve or 1 disc diameter around it is usually neovascularization at disc. This is an image of neovascularization at disc with extensive capillary non-perfusion and ischemic retina here. The laser spots, they might sometimes be mistaken. So they are the areas of block fluorescence which surrounded by hyperfluorescent borders. We can see many skip lesions in the fluorescein angiogram here, and presence of persistent neovascularization despite laser, which warrants additional laser in such cases. Coming to stages of diabetic retinopathy, so it is 0, 1, 2. It's divided into mild, moderate, severe diabetic retinopathy and proliferative diabetic retinopathy, and macular edema 0 or 1. So mild NPDR, where there are a few microaneurysms which might be seen more on fluorescein angiography. Moderate NPDR, where there is presence of clumps of microaneurysms which are more than and some hemorrhages which are more than mild but doesn't really fit into severe diabetic retinopathy. Then there is a severe diabetic retinopathy where 4-to-1 rule is followed, where there are extensive changes throughout the fundus which can be seen. While the proliferative diabetic retinopathy is presence of neovascularization elsewhere along with or at the disc along with the capillary non-perfusion areas. The high risk PDR, where there is the neovascularization disc is large or there is presence of pre-retinal hemorrhage. And then there is a vitreous hemorrhage which requires extensive management. Diabetic maculopathy might be focal or diffuse depending on the clusters of microaneurysms and their spread from the leakage site. Ischemic maculopathy, which can be seen on the fluorescein angiogram with enlargement and distortion of FAZ. This is one of the most important reasons why fluorescein angiography should be done. A patient may have fairly good visual acuity even in presence of early ischemic maculopathy, and which can progress post-treatment and leading to drop in visual acuity. So unless you have a fluorescein angiograph at presentation, you might miss this finding and that can lead to problems at later stage. Now this angiography can be fluorescein or OCT angio when it comes to macular lesions, but for peripheral retina, the dye-based angiography is probably the better choice. And we will hear more about macular lesions, I'm sure, from Dr. Sunil in his talk on OCT angio. So this is an example of a fluorescein angiogram of a patient where we can see 45-degree area. This is one of the problems or one of the limitations, not problems, the limitations of traditional fluorescein angiography is we can see only limited area, about 45 degrees, while the retinal imaging can be extended up to 200 degrees. Here we can see the lesions at the posterior pole quite well, but even with the traditional fundus cameras with the newer softwares, we can get image, montage image fairly easily without too much of hassle and effort, and it gives up to 100 degree of peripheral retinal imaging. Here we can see the montage image gives us much better idea about capillary non-perfusion areas. So if you are just going to go by the clinical picture, we would miss these peripheral lesions, and this patient would actually require very close monitoring. This patient, if not angiography is not done, it might be missed and patient might come with advanced lesions at later stage. these are the 7 subfields which are defined by ETDRS study, and these are the montage pictures which can help us, or they were used for grading of diabetic retinopathy in ETDRS study. In the past, with older film-based cameras, it would take a lot of effort to take these pictures, but it is, as we can see, it is much easier to be done, easier to do now with modern cameras. So, but it is not as good as ultra wide field cameras which are available to us. This is a wonderful, beautiful image of taken with Mirante system by Dr. Unnikrishnan Nair of Chaitanya Hospital, and it gives us almost aura to aura view of in single shot. So this is the beauty of ultra wide field angiography, which gives us much large. Yeah, just it will take a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Ultra wide field imaging gives us much wider field of view, and we can see all the stages of fluorescein angiography in single frame. And with the modern systems, we can get up to 200 degrees of retinal surface in single shot. The image time acquisition is reduced. Reduced patient compliance is required. Transient images can be obtained and include peripheral pathology. There is fluorescein angiography is consistent in all images phases, and no montage artifacts are there. This is an image by Dr. Darius Schroff, which gives us idea of how wide the field can be and how much lesions that we are missing with the just central 7 subfield images. So we can see a whole lot of peripheral peripheral CNP areas, and which are not lasered. It gives us ability to show more retinal pathology in eye judged by 7 subfields. Peripheral non-perfusion can be picked up and neovascularizations, and the current data suggests that these ultra-wide field images give additional and more extensive PDR pathologies. DR lesions captured by these images likely to carry prognostication value in terms of PDR development. So to conclude, fluorescein angiography in diabetic retinopathy is alive and kicking, and it must be done at baseline, in my opinion. It is essential in diagnosis, grading and treatment, planning and prognostication. And color fundus and OCT alone may underdiagnose early PDR cases and lead to disasters at later stage. Ultra-wide field is a revolutionary technology which might still be expensive technology at the time, but as the time passes, it will become available to all of us. But it is helpful in diagnosing far peripheral retinal pathologies and alter treatment protocols in year to come, which I am sure of. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Dr. Unni, for Sunil, for giving me opportunity to speak in this wonderful seminar.
Thank you, Manish, for that nice overview of fluorescein angiography. You can stop sharing your screen. Now I invite the next speaker, Dr. Sachin Mouli. He heads the Netradarshan Eye Hospitals, Belgaum. So he is also an excellent surgeon with a great academic record. And I call him upon to speak on role of B-scan and UBM in diabetic retinopathy. Over to you, Sachin. Screen is visible. You can go ahead with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. At the outset, I'd like to thank Scientific Committee, AIOS, and Sunil for having this wonderful IC. Just a moment, I'll just put it on. Okay.
Just play button, push the play button, this is the full screen.
So we'll go ahead with the talk. My talk today will be on the role of B-scan and UBM in DR. B-scan is a very well-known, age-old, investigation which we advise for diabetic retinopathy cases, especially when there is a lot of media opacity and vitreous hemorrhage and other indications. We'll go one by one. How does B-scan help us in clinical scenario when we see a case of diabetic retinopathy, especially when there is a media opacity? So it helps us to diagnose. It is very useful in diagnostic as a diagnostic tool. It also helps us to prognosticate the case and definitely helps in surgical planning. Now we'll go one by one how the B-scan would be used in cases of diabetic retinopathy. The most common indication would be a vitreous hemorrhage. In the case of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, to understand the status of the retina. Then the other indications would be like total cataract or a dense cataract. Even a dense asteroids would be indicated, a thick PCO. In some cases of NVG, wherein there is a corneal edema and you are unable to assess the posterior pole and the retinal status. In some cases of combined retinal detachment and TRDs, you would like to do, especially associated with vitreous hemorrhage, you'd like to do a B-scan to understand the extent of the retinal detachment. In cases of post-operative, post-surgical, like post-vitrectomy, B-scan would be very handy to understand whether it is a diffuse hemorrhage following the surgery or it is a retinal detachment underlying following along with the vitreous hemorrhage. In certain cases of post-operative hypertony, to understand if there are choroidals or if there is some other pathology inside, it would be a handy tool to see. In cases of vitreous hemorrhage, B-scan can be used to understand the status of the retina, status of the PVD, and if there is associated TRD and combined retinal detachment. B-scan, the features of B-scan in a fresh or acute hemorrhage would be the echoes will be scattered and less echogenic with a good after movement. As the time passes by, the vitreous hemorrhage gets more thicker and denser and causing it more echogenic, more organized, more membranous, with reduced mobility. And you can also see a blood-lined PVDs in such cases. Sorry. B-scan also demonstrates as the status of PVD, whether the PVD is complete or incomplete. It also helps us understand whether the echoes are more of intragel or subhyaloid echoes. Basically, why this is important for us is to understand like the extent of vitreous hemorrhage when we plan a surgery. Now, this is a case wherein you can see predominantly intragel echoes and a blood layer PVD with an incomplete PVD. Basically, it is attached to the posterior pole, and this is how it helps us understand the disease better and helps us to plan the surgeries. This is a case of massive subhyaloid hemorrhage with incomplete PVD, wherein there is a peripapillary membrane also, which we can see. So these are very, very important for us to make a surgical decision as to when the surgery has to be taken, because this type of massive subhyaloid hemorrhage is unlikely to get absorbed on its own, and we may have to plan surgery. Vitreous hemorrhage along with TRDs is a very important finding which we see in day-to-day practice and which definitely helps us decide whether to take him up for surgery or not. This is a case wherein you can see a picture wherein there's a TRD with the focal attachment to the incomplete PVD. There are plenty of subhyaloid and intraretinal echoes. We should also understand that there could be multiple membranes, like especially in cases of vitreitis, wherein you can see a multi-layer membrane. All of them would have a good after movement, and it should be differentiated from a retinal detachment. Coming to the tractional retinal detachments, on B-scan would be picked up and located, and basically we can understand whether the TRDs are involving the macula or not, or it's extramacular. It could be a focal detachment, it could be multiple TRDs, or it could be a broad TRD involving the posterior pole, depending on the disease severity. Basically, what we need to understand on a B-scan when there's a TRD is how is the vitreous attached to it, whether there's a focal attachment or whether there's a broad attachment, which will again help us plan during surgery. If there are subretinal echoes in the TRD, that means there is probably a subretinal bleed or a long-standing TRD with a subretinal exudation. If there's a subretinal bleed, it indicates the severity of the disease as to how much the vitreous hemorrhage and extent of hemorrhage which is occurring. These are the cases of TRDs again, where you can see a focal attachment and a broad attachment in earlier two cases, and there's a hammock-like TRD wherein the complexity of the membrane can be understood by the B-scan. TRD involving the macula is definitely an indication when there's a vitreous hemorrhage. B-scan definitely helps us prognosticate this case and help us to take up for surgery. Combined retinal detachments associated with vitreous hemorrhage, you should definitely like to do a B scan and find out what is the extent of TRD and how are the vitreous attachment to the TRD. Specifically, in cases where we cannot see the disc or the posterior pole, whether a combined retinal detachment with a closed funnel or extensive preretinal proliferation would definitely help us severity of the disease. So as I said earlier, how does it help us prognosticate when there's a dense vitreous hemorrhage with no PVD? So surgery is going to be difficult in such cases. So with the dense vitreous hemorrhage, we should tell the patient about the prognosis based on these findings. So if there's extensive preretinal fibrovascular proliferation, that is very broad attachments on a B scan with vitreous hemorrhage, causing a large area of TRD or a combined retinal detachment would definitely be a bad prognostic sign. Taut or a broad attachment, as I said, anterior hyaloid proliferation, if you note on a B scan, especially in the area of just behind the lens or just in the anterior hyaloid, would definitely be a bad prognostic sign. Underlying there could be a complete CRD or a extensive membrane formation. Subretinal echoes and bands are again an indication of a long-standing TRD or a CRD would carry a bad prognostic sign. Extension of CRD and the closed funnel configuration on a B scan would be again a bad prognostic sign. A thin atrophic retinal echo, thin membrane-like echo, when you see it would also give us a prognostic indicator that whether the surgery would help the patient or not. How does the B scan help in surgical planning? When there is a dense cataract and other eye has a diabetic retinopathy and you would like to plan a surgery, especially a combined surgery would be required, B scan is definitely handy, and you can see if there are if the case has a vitreous hemorrhage or a TRD or a combined RD. It helps us understand the vitreous attachment to the retina, basically when you plan a surgery where you want to truncate the cone during vitrectomy. Especially we'll understand whether there's a focal attachment or a broad attachment. Based on this, you can plan your intraocular tamponades. If there is a combined detachment, definitely you would like to use an oil, or if there is just an TRD in the posterior pole with a focal attachment, a gas would do. Or if you are anticipating a break during the membrane dissection with the extent of preretinal proliferation, and you can understand where the PVD is occurring and where you can get the plane for your membrane dissection. Asteroid hyalosis is a definitive differential diagnosis in diabetic patients, wherein this also presents with a lot of intraocular echoes. The differentiating point would be there would be a clear zone in front of the retina and the vitreous, optically clear zone. So this would differentiate it from a vitreous hemorrhage, and it's definitely useful in cases of PDR, especially when you cannot assess the retina with a dense cataract. Coming lastly, very quickly, the role of UBM in DR is limited, but very, very specific and useful in cases of, mostly in cases of recurrent postoperative hemorrhages, in cases of hypertonia, and in some cases of neovascular glaucoma. There's a wonderful study which is published in Ophthalmology 2000 by Dr. Munna Bende et al., which actually analyzed the site of pars plana vitrectomy area, especially the sclerotomy area, wherein they classified it into eight types. They did a UBM after 6 to 8 weeks following surgery. They classified it as a well-healed gape or a plaque. I'll just take 30 seconds, okay? A gape, plaque, or vitreous incarceration, whether there's a fibrovascular proliferation at the site of sclerotomy, and intraocular proliferation was also seen. So all these will tell us the prognosis of the case, why there is a recurrent vitreous hemorrhage, and how do we manage these cases. These are the pictures which shows wound gape and the fibrovascular ingrowth. The down picture here, you can see the fibrovascular growth at the intraocular phase. Cases with, as I said, recurrent vitreous hemorrhage and no FVP at the sclerotomy seen on UBM did well later when the patients were taken up for a resurgery. In cases where there was a ciliary body detachment like this, if you see the ciliary body detachment with a lot of membrane echoes around the pars plana region, would definitely be a bad prognostic indicator. Okay, I'd like to finish my discussion on this, and thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Sachin, for this brief overview of ultrasound and UBM. You can unshare your screen. Next speaker will be Dr. Rupak Kanti Biswas. He is a director as well as the senior vitreoretinal surgeon at Netralayam Eye Hospitals, Kolkata. He has done many vitreoretinal surgeries, more than 8,000 to 10,000 vitreoretinal surgeries. He has got many presentations in national and international forum. And he has got many prestigious awards. Among them, the prestigious award is the Red Buckler Award from the ASRS. And he has won many awards at the URETNA and AAOS. I will be calling upon Rupak Kanti Biswas to deliver his talk on OCT biomarkers in diabetic macular edema. Over to you, Rupak.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, audible. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Dr. Sunil, for giving me this opportunity and this excellent, diabetic retinopathy. It is a need of the day. This is OCT biomarker for the diabetic retinopathy. Is one of the important. Is just for the general ophthalmologists who are attending this session. Is OCT biomarker is it is a biomarker. That means you biologically there are few features which we are going to discuss on the basis of OCT, which determines for the treatment of DME. Now, just to do a very rapid recap of different layers of retina. This is nerve fiber layer, followed by all ganglion cell layer, then inner, outer nuclear layer, and then last comes your photoreceptor layer. Here, the most important is that ellipsoid zone and external limiting membrane. These are the two white lines which we do see it here, is one of the important part of it. So this is one of the most important article on this topic. And actually the pathophysiology of diabetic retinopathy or the DME is a very complex things. There are a lot of as we all mainly we know that the VEGF is one of the most important factor which is responsible for the development of this process. But over a period of time, we have understood that there are significant role of the inflammatory markers as well. So how these OCT changes actually will represent that in which scenario what you should do and where you should inject whether anti-VEGF or steroid. So I'll just give you an example for that. This is a hyperreflective spots. This is the presence of subretinal fluid in the subfoveal area. So this is one of the important prognostic marker. So how does it help us in this way? So these hyperreflective spot, as I'll show you later also, these are the main characteristic of that. They will have a number one, they have a very small size, usually less than 30 micron size, and the reflectivity usually similar to the nerve fiber layer which I have shown you earlier, and there is no backscattering. So by this way you can differentiate whether it is a hard exudate or it is actually the hyperreflective spots. So here is example of those hyperreflective spot. I think you can see those. I have just marked it here. So all those are hyperreflective spot. And in presence of hyperreflective spot, this is an indication that these are the patient who's having a little more preponderance for having the more cytokines, and these people are respond well for the dexamethasone implant as reported in different cases. We'll show you this is a post treatment with the dexamethasone implant. You can see, but there is still presence of some amount of the hyperreflective spots, but which has been reduced from the previous one. So with this increase, there is an increased interest of there are associated with hyperreflective spots there is increased foveal autofluorescence area and the presence of subfoveal fluid. So this increased autofluorescence of the central area, which also decreases after treatment, and this is supported by microperimetry. So if you can see these changes in the initial pre-treatment in the microperimetry is this red area which has been converted to yellow and the green area, and this is one of the important documentation for the changes occurring post-treatment when you have the hyperreflective spot and increased autofluorescence. External limiting membrane and ellipsoid zone analysis is one of the another now next level. So the most important here is here you can see the different level of the changes. These changes does not occur in one day. So you have to have, the image A, which is showing, there is no disruption of the ELM and ellipsoid zone. You can hear subfoveal area. There are partial disruption in this area, and in last scenario there is totally disruption and there is disorganization of the layers, retinal layers as well. So the DME of the ellipsoid zone here, another example of, you can see these are the ellipsoid zone and photoreceptor loss. So in these kind of cases, even if you treat them successfully or reduce the intra retinal fluid, also the visual outcome may not be good. So this is how we prognosticate our cases before giving intravitreal injection. This is disorganization of retinal inner layers. This is another important fact, another important prognostic marker for this. But this also does not occur in one day. So these are all changes occur over a period of time. So if you can catch them at the earliest possibility, so that you can reverse it back as well. You can see in this left side A picture, there is a disorganization of the retinal layers in this area, but here later this part, you still have some amount of the delineation of the retinal architecture in this area. Vis-a-vis, there is no in this area, you can, though there is a presence of a significant amount of the intraretinal fluid compared to here, but here the drill is not present here in this area. All the layers you can make out almost, though it is a compressed, but you can make it out. So in this way, this is one of the important prognostic factors. So obviously the left side, the B patient will have a better outcome after treatment. So as you can see in the initial phases, if you can detect them, so in the baseline in this picture, there is over a period of 8 months time. So initially there was intraretinal fluid, but there is no initial minimal amount of the drill in this area present. But once you treat, this drill also resolved to some extent, and the fluid also has gone, and later on you can after around 8 months time, there is a significant restoration of the vision and the retinal architecture as well. This is a case where presence of combination of all those areas. This is hyperreflective spots are present here. You can see the ISOS junction and the ELM, that area is intact. Presence of subretinal fluid, presence of localized area of drill. So this is in one picture you can make out all those parameters. So this is in short about treatment for the medical treatment. And now the surgical outcome biomarker. So if you have a VMT in presence of DME, so in those situations it is difficult to treat them only with anti-VEGF or the steroid. So unless until you release that vitreomacular traction, this patient is not going to do well. So we need to keep this thing in mind and then treat accordingly. But even in presence of vitreomacular traction or in an advanced stage of diabetic retinopathy, here you can see there is a significant disruption of the photoreceptor. So in this A and B, so pre-treatment and post-treatment, you can see that this area of ellipse, there is a significant improvement, and this area there is disruption of the ellipsoid zone. So there is not much of, even after treatment. Also, there is hardly any improvement even after doing pars-plana vitrectomy with ILM peeling. So this is another area of presence of epiretinal membrane. Again, the whole central part of the retina is being pulled up. So even if you treat them with so much of multiple anti-VEGF injection, also it does not improve. But if you treat them at the earliest possibility before change in the EZ and external limiting membrane, so you can have a better result. But if you land up of having this area destroyed in the subfoveal area, you can achieve the anatomical success, the visual outcome is not that great. So in brief, to talk about the OCT Octa biomarkers, I think Dr. Sunil will be talking about on this topic. But most important, I just wanted to re-emphasize there are a few things. Foveal avascular zone area, foveal avascular zone contour integrity, average vascular caliber, vessel tortuosity and vessel density. These are the parameters we usually look for, like here, look in any OCT biomarker, Octa biomarker. But out of these areas, the first two is not of much of importance, so does not make any difference. Average vessels caliber is also can give you a false result when the capillaries are gone and the vessels, the larger vessels are there, so you can have the. I'll just finish. But most importantly, vessel density in the parafoveal area is an important marker. I just acknowledge the effort of Dr. Nandi, Dr. Maitra, and Dr. Mahato. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupak. We'll take questions in the end, and we'll have a panel sort of discussion in the end of all the talks.
Sure.
Our next speaker will be Dr. Unnikrishnan Nair. He's the chairman of Chaitanya Group of Eye Hospitals, Kerala. He did his Vitreoretinal Fellowship from Shankar Nethralaya as well as from Sydney Eye Hospital. And he's got a very keen interest on retinal imaging. He conducts a very famous conference, Retina Imaging Congress. He's a great clinician and with a great academic interest. Over to you, Unni, for your talk on choroidal imaging. Let's look into the choroid beyond retina. Over to you, Unni. You can start sharing your presentation.
So thank you, Sunil, for the introduction. I'll be starting now. So I'm very glad to be a part of this instruction course. I'll be talking about choroidal imaging in diabetic retinopathy, the lessons learned, no financial discussions. The choroidal anatomy is a highly specialized vascular supportive anatomy, and it is multi-structured. And as we know, there's a fine choroid capillary, medium-sized vessel, sacculars and larger space, halars, and a suprachoroid which gives structural integrity to the entire body. In diabetic patients, we know that a choroid capillary dropout happens. It's the most basic physical feature that we can demonstrate on hospital staining. In a less involved choroid, we see normal-looking organized globules, some of which has tortuous areas with accumulation of constriction, and some of which are dilated. With progressive disease, there's a diffuse loss of the choroid capillaries, and as it goes, there's complete loss eventually, as you see in the extreme photograph on the right-hand side. The thickening of the bricks is visualized. Histopathology also reveals intrachoroidal neovascularizations. In this wonderful electron microscopic photograph, you can see changes mirroring retinopathy changes like dilatation, narrowing, outreaching, the presence of choroidal microinjuries and endothelial cell indentations are seen and demonstrated. And these are reflected in the angiographic findings of the choroid diabetes, in which hyperfluorescent globules of the choroid capillaries are seen. Hyperfluorescent globules with delayed filling due to inner choriocapillary ischemia, the presence of choroidal aneurysms, neovascularizations, tortuosity, and late-phase hypoperfusion are all findings that you see in the choroid patient with diabetes. An interesting phenomenon is inverted inflow phenomenon, that is, the choroidal vascular filling time is seemingly longer than the retinal vascular filling, vessel filling time. As you see in this picture, the retinal vessels have appeared much earlier than the choroidal circulation. And this is the inverted inflow phenomenon. And it has a significant association with severity of diabetic disease. So to summarize, indocyanine angiography shows us evidence of choroidal hyperperfusion in the late phases, the inverted inflow phenomena, and large hyperfluorescent spots seen in the angiography. So on a whole, there is a reduction in the choroidal blood flow, which is of lower velocity, and there is increased resistance in the choroidal circulation. The next, we'll look at this choroidal thickness changes. So it is very interesting to know that in patients with diabetes, the choroid seems to be thinner, lesser vascular areas, reduced vascularity, as we mentioned, with choroid dropout. But as a patient develops diabetic retinopathy with increasing severity, the choroid seemingly becomes thicker, and there's an increase in the significant in the vascular areas. However, this is extremely controversial with reports going both ways as to the change of the choroid. An EDA of the choroid in diabetes shows that a healthy eye has a bowl-shaped appearance. So a bowl-shaped appearance with the thickest area being at the subchoroidal area. And with the progression of diabetic retinopathy, this bowl-shaped appearance changes into a concave, convex, contour, or mesh-shaped appearance of the choroidoscleral interface, as you can see in the lower picture, from the smooth bowl-shaped appearance to a mesh-shaped appearance. So these are some of the pictures that demonstrate a patient without diabetic retinopathy or diabetes in the top left-hand corner, the appearance of the bowl shape or the S-curve appearance. And later, picture C and D, what you can notice is something very interesting. The thickest point of the choroid is not subfoveal and it moves to the temporal side of the fovea, which is a very interesting point that has been done by the study. So the choroid in DR, eventually it shows that there is a greater choroidal vascular area and there is a lesser number of inflection points as the disease increases. An inflection point is a point in which there is a sudden change in the contour, that is a contour becoming convex or vice versa. So patients with DR had a thicker choroid, greater choroidal volume, a more posteriorly curved choroidoscleral interface, and a lesser number of inflection points as a severity. So these images show that with DR increased severity, the choroidal thickness, the greatest choroidal thickness has increased from about 261 to 465 in the pictures. However, the choroidal vascularity in terms of CBI shows a decrease in choroidal vascularity severity. So that is a ratio between the stromal elements and the vascular. And this could be due to a selective reduction in the interchoroidal layers, focal choroidal thickening, and as we mentioned earlier, the displacement of the temporal displacement of this point of the choroid from the foveal. So, other interesting features is that there is a decrease in choroidal thickness after anti-VEGF therapy and after anti-focal correction. All could be associated with a generalized reduction. Circulation. There are quite a few studies that mention the choroidal thickness. Some of them mention increasing choroidal thickness and some are reducing choroidal thickness with the severity of the disease. However, the choroidal thickness as a predictor shows that the greater baseline choroidal thickness is generally associated with better visual acuity and anatomic lines after anti-VEGF. On-force-OHD, a wonderful tool, shows that in the Sackler's layer, you can see areas where the Sackler's vessels are not visualized. Whether this is authentic, true finding or an artifactual finding because of projection is slightly debatable, but there seems to be focal areas of non-visualization in the Sackler's layer, and also extreme focal vascular narrow of these layers. Moreover, findings like aneurysms are seen in the Haller's layer on-force OCT, and sudden terminations of the Haller's layer causing vascular stumps are also been noted. The OCT angiography, however, shows and demonstrates the best that the progressive choroidal capillary loss, which we know to be associated with progression of diabetes. And the pictures on the extreme right shows a choroidal capillary there. It is evident that from focal dropouts, the areas, confluence of the dropout areas, and more diffuse area of dropout is seen in 8 disease. Again, the same is demonstrated with the color-coded vascular indexes, where you can see greater areas of choroidal capillary dropout. So one thing we have to keep in caution that the choroidal circulation is extremely sensitive to growing system diseases, systemic medications, even to things like drinking caffeinated drinks also. So to summarize, the diabetic choroidopathy, as we know, there have been demonstrable histopathological changes in choroidal capillary dropout and intrachoroidal neovascularization. On electron microscopy, the presence of epithelial cell infiltrations, narrowing of the choroidal circulation, and choroidal microaneurysms have been demonstrated. A decreased flow and increased resistance to choroidal circulation is what we believe is present. And ICGA demonstrates late areas of lack of choroidal circulation, choroidal hypoperfusion, the inverted inflow phenomena, large areas of hyperfluence spots in the ICGA. Enhanced depth imaging shows a decrease in choroidal vascularity with severity and inner choroidal thinning and displacement of the choroidal thickness, the maximum choroidal thickness temporarily to the fovea. Structural emphasis shows the presence of unvisualized or unseen vessels in the sacculus areas, halar aneurysms and sudden termination of halars vascular stumps, and generally focal vascular narrowing of the larger choroidal vessels. And OCT angiography has been the best tool to demonstrate progressive choroidal loss with this increase in severity of the diabetes. So choroidal encephalopathy or the diabetic choroid may be a condition which has independent features to the retinopathy that we see in diabetes mellitus. It is not well understood, and we are not sure whether these changes are precursor changes to the retinopathy disease or whether they are reactive changes. But it is highly interesting to note that some of the changes mirror the severity of the disease and could have a direct effect on the vascularity of the eye. Thank you very much for your attention. Listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Uni, for that nice overview of choroidal imaging in the diabetics. Let's take the questions at the end of most of the talks. Let's move on to the surgical topic in imaging. Now I call upon the next speaker. Let me introduce the next speaker, Dr. Aditya Kelkar. He is the chairman or the chief of National Institute of Ophthalmology. He has got a great academic career. He has presented many papers in national and international forums and conducted instruction courses. He has won many prestigious awards. Recent one is from the American Society of Retinal Surgeons, that is Red Buckler's Award. And he has won many awards in the AOS also. With this kind introduction, I would like to call upon Dr. Aditya Kelkar to give his talk on intraoperative OCT and diabetic vitrectomy. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. So first of all, thank you for including me in this instruction course. I'll be presenting a very short topic on intraoperative OCT in diabetic patients. So as you know, many scenarios exist in diabetic vitrectomies where preoperative OCT is not possible. For example, in patients who have vitreous hemorrhage, you cannot have a preoperative OCT. And therefore, at the end of clearing up of the vitreous hemorrhage, if on table you can see what the macular pathology is all about, then you can always modify your approach. For example, if the patient has epiretinal membrane, then you can think of removing the epiretinal membrane, or you feel that there is cystoid macular edema, you can always take care of it by using intravitreal anti-VEGF or some other steroid implant. So in this case, after clearing up the vitreous hemorrhage, we could note that there is epiretinal membrane. And so this epiretinal membrane is then taken care of. So intraoperative OCT helps us in making certain decisions, which otherwise at times you may end up not taking into account certain pathologies such as this one. And then the visual results will be suboptimal. So it's always a good tool to have in your armamentarium so as to improve your safety as well as the efficacy of the treatment. This is another case where at the end of clearing up of the vitreous hemorrhage, we could see that there is epiretinal membrane and then internal limiting membrane and ERM is removed together. It also sometimes helps us in making decisions on table by giving a quick feedback. For example, in the scenarios where you are facing a situation where there is vitreous hemorrhage and like in this case of a vitreous hemorrhage patient, it's obviously practically impossible to get a preoperative OCT. So once we clear up the subhyaloid hemorrhage, then have a look at what the posterior pole offers. And it definitely improves the visual outcome, because if you don't identify these pathologies with your naked eye, which is often possible, of course, I agree. But at times when things are very subtle, you may miss these things. And therefore the intraoperative OCT can be of use in scenarios such as this one. So in this case, as I said, we can introduce intravitreal triamcinolone in case you have cystoid macular edema at the end of clearing up of the vitreous hemorrhage. Another interesting scenario is to identify on table quickly whether this is actually a macular hole or a pseudo hole. You want a quick feedback from the OCT, and it shows that it's a pseudo hole. So then you can easily approach through the same area, because that's the cleavage plane, and then introduce a posterior vitreous detachment and remove the vitreous. So it's also useful, as I said, for a quick feedback on table to identify certain pathologies, just in case you are in doubt. Another interesting aspect, it's not just useful for the retinal visualization, but also at times you can see there's a clear-cut wound gape, and therefore a stitch in time would definitely help in these cases to prevent hypotonia and help us to ensure that there's no recurrence of vitreous hemorrhage. So these are certain scenarios where I find intraoperative OCT, especially in diabetic cases, will be useful. Thank you once again, Dr. Sunil, for having me in this course. I think if there are questions, we'll be taking it up later, looks like.
Yeah, sure, Aditya. Thank you for the talk on the intraoperative OCT.
So thanks a lot.
Now we will be moving from structural imaging to the functional imaging of the retina. So now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Chaitra Jaydev. She is a senior VR consultant from Narayan Nethralaya. She has got more than 100 publications to her credit, international publications. She is a great researcher as well as a clinician. And I would like to hand over I asked Dr. Chaitra Jaydev to deliver a talk on RFI and retinal oximetry and diabetic retinopathy. Over to you, Chaitra.
Yeah, thanks, Sunil, for this opportunity, and to AIOS. This is, I must say, a rather tough talk to do now, because I have, we have done a lot of work on RFI and oximetry some time back, and as of now, because we have used Octa and it has come in a big way into our practice, we've, more or less stopped using these devices. But I will give you a brief overview of what we've done in the past and how it is probably a little different from using Octa. Yeah, I have no financial disclosures. Now, coming to RFI itself, this is how the device looks. It's a non-invasive diagnostic approach for the measurement of retinal blood flow velocity. We can map the vascular network structures very similar to the Octa. And it also gives us information of the oximetry and the metabolic status of the retina. So overall, it's an in vivo, non-invasive imaging of both the retinal structure and of the function. So what we saw all along were imaging where we were able to actually see the morphology, but not clearly delineate the function as to whether the retina is functioning optimally. Is it able to give whatever else the functions that are required for good visual system here. So the RFI system has a fundus camera. It has a stroboscopic illumination, fast filter wheel, and an LED-based stimulus generator. Multiple snapshots of the retina are taken in less than 0.2 seconds. I will show you a video of that. And this high speed reduces interframe retinal motion, and it tracks the movement of the RBCs. So it uses multiple sequences, and it therefore creates a capillary perfusion map. And it performs also blood flow velocity measurements. Now, the other, or if you have to put it together, it gives us a non-invasive capillary perfusion map. We call it as the NCPM. It also gives us the velocity. It gives us the measurement of the oxygen saturation, and also gives us some information of the metabolic state. As far as I know, not too much inputs are there as far as the metabolic demand or the state of the retina goes. Even using the RFI, it's been rather difficult. So this is how the imaging comes across. This is the microcirculation or the NCPM map. This is the blood flow velocity. It gives us the quantification, the oximetry map, and finally the metabolic map. Now, this is something that we've studied the most, so I will be elaborating a little bit more, and Jay has done a lot of work using the RFI as well. So by directly tracking the movement of the RBCs, the RFI is able to create a map of the retinal microvasculature. And when studying this vasculature, we are comparing it with FFA. Witkin et al. Have shown us that RFI could visualize a higher order vessel branching, and also the FAZ was more clearly delineated and it appeared to be much smaller when using the RFI. Going on to the flow velocity, under green illumination, the hemoglobin within the RBCs provide a natural high contrast chromophore. It therefore allows the RFI to track the movement of the individual RBCs through the 8 sequential images. Allows direct measurement of the distance traveled between the RBCs, and that divided by the time it takes to capture the series of images actually yields a measurement of the blood flow velocity. So if you can see the video here, rapid sequence 8 images are taken in less than 0.2 seconds, and therefore we are able to measure the blood flow velocity, and it gives an automatic quantification in millimeters per second. Going on to the oximetry that's there in the RFI, it uses a multispectral imaging mode, and it detects the differences between the absorption spectrum of oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin in order to give us the difference and therefore determine the oxygenation. Accurate oxygen saturation maps may therefore help provide additional details in the pathophysiology of various diseases of the retina, especially vascular diseases, because we do know that there's a lot of ischemia here involved. Now, coming to the metabolic function, the retinal functional signal is studied by analyzing the reflectance changes in the retina after stimulating it with a visual stimulus. Such functional reflectance signals are small. They originate from activity-dependent metabolic, hemodynamic, and fast and slow light scattering changes that are seen. The difference between the post-stimulated and the pre-stimulated images reflects the metabolic state or demand and the functional state of the activated axons of the ganglion cells. Now, there are some studies about this. We have not done much. So based on the intensity flavor protein fluorescence in retinal tissues, it possesses potential for diabetic retinopathy screening and monitoring for progression and improvement. Field et al. Have shown that individuals with DR in at least one eye had significantly greater mitochondrial flavor protein autofluorescence activity than in diabetic patients without retinopathy in either eye. So overall, looking at the applications in diabetic retinopathy, it has definitely opened possibility for various disease pathologies associated with alterations in the blood flow, whether it is in the capillaries, arterioles, or venules, and different collateral vascular patterns in normal as well as diseased retina can help us actually compare using the RFI. We had written a brief review on the clinical application, and what we were able to see, especially in patients with DR, is the shunt and anastomotic vessels were very well delineated, and the NCPM especially was useful. It helped us detect and follow up avascular areas. It also helped in follow-up of abnormal vascular patterns, be it loops or neovascularizations. And it also helped in monitoring the effect of guided laser treatment. So here you can see the FAZ can be very well delineated on the NCPM in patients with NPDR. And when we compared it with FA, we were able to delineate the non-perfusion areas and neovascularization and telangiectatic vessels as well. Here again, comparison between FFA and RFI, you can see the neovascularization. Of course, the leakage is not seen on RFI as seen on FFA. The blood flow velocity helps in early monitoring of the progression of diabetic retinopathy and also the effect of treatment and guided laser treatment. So this was one study which showed that there was an increase in arterial and venous blood flow velocity in patients with early DM and with no DR as such. These findings support the notion that abnormalities in vessel function exist even before the development of structural changes. So function before structural changes. Retinal oximetry, other than an RFI, we also have a standalone oximetry device. It has been shown that oxygen saturation is increased in retinal arterioles and venules, and the oxygen saturation in retinal vessels in diabetic patients was found to be dependent on the severity and the type of the severity of the disease. So this is a study on the oximetry in patients with DR. They found that in eyes with DR, there was increased venular oxygen saturation and decreased AV difference compared to eyes without DR, suggesting an altered metabolic state as well. So like I said, there's a standalone device to measure the oximetry along with the RFI, and this is how it gives us the the saturation, the oxygenation across each of these blood vessels. One of our consultants who left recently has also completed his PhD on oximetry itself, and he has published the normative database, and it provides basically an Indian population to compare with previous studies, the age, the vessel diameter, all of it was studied in this. But the drawbacks that he found was that arterial saturation do tend to go above 100%, and the saturation values are different for disc-centered and quadrant-centered images. And the saturation does appear to be higher when the vessel diameter is smaller. So the last thing that I like to share was we had done a quick study between RFI and Octa because we're using Octa so much more, and we wanted to compare the non-invasive capillary perfusion maps and velocity measurements between RFI and Octa. We use the AngioView device. To give you a brief background, and non-invasive imaging is important because we need to keep repeating it. The adverse effects compared to systemic administration of contrast agents are well known. We need to visualize a microvascular architecture over a large area with maximum resolution, and quantifying blood flow may be the key to unlocking explanations for several conditions that are poorly understood. So we compared basically macular imaging on RFI with OptoView, and we had about 15 healthy normals that we had included in this study. So if you see the panel above and below, above is the NCPM map, the non-invasive capillary perfusion map, compared to the Octa below. You can see how comparable it is. And this is the mapping of the blood velocity. We did a comparison between image parameters and velocity parameters. What we saw that the RFI offers a wider field of view with a higher pixel resolution compared to AngioView. And since 35 degrees of the image gives a large field of view, 2 images are adequate to complete the image of the posterior pole with good resolution. And velocity parameters showed that the velocity in arterioles is higher than in venules. It also showed that velocity in larger arterioles is higher than in the smaller ones. So this is, a closer comparison between the Octa and the RFI. So quickly to compare between the two, Octa definitely has the advantage of segmentation and depth, and it has lesser resolution, however, compared to the RFI. So the advantages of RFI are good image quality, wider field of view, but the limitations are it lacks depth resolved information, and image acquisition is very, very difficult and compared to the Octa and even for the patient because it has a very, very bright flash. Thank you, and I acknowledge the help of my colleague, Dr. Aditi, in preparing these slides.
Thank you, Chandra, for that nice talk and excellent images. Let's move on to the last talk of the session, that is on the Octa and diabetic retinopathy. Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So what's the rationale of using an Octa in diabetic retinopathy? As we know that diabetic retinopathy is a slowly progressive disease. It has got a long subclinical course. So it tends to develop clinical signs very late. So early changes are very subtle. So imaging carries a very relevance in these diabetic patients to pick up the lesions. So sometimes the clinical examination alone underestimates the diabetic retinopathy severity. And studies have shown that almost 40% of the patients with diabetic retinopathy will tend to have some form of macular ischemia. So that ischemic changes should be picked up by these imaging modalities. So what are the advantages of Octa in diabetic retinopathy? Basically, it identifies the diabetic retinopathy in its earliest stage, that is a subclinical retinopathy. And it is a non-invasive imaging modality. The imaging time is quick. FFA looks at only the superficial capillary plexus, but the Octa looks at even the deep capillary plexus also. You can know the exact depth of the lesions like microaneurysms. that provides the detailed information of the capillaries without leakage. So whenever there is a leakage, the clarity of the lesions will be lost. So that is an advantage with Octa. With our recent ultra-wide field imaging images, you can go up to the near periphery, if not the far periphery, for the imaging with Octa as shown in this picture. So most of the microvascular changes of diabetic retinopathy can be picked up on Octa, except the microaneurysms, which I'll be telling about the limitations of microaneurysm imaging. You can pick up the vascular loops, the non-perfusion areas as shown here, the FSZ erosion, the venous beading, and the multiple capillary beds. All these things can be imaged with the Octa. So basically, we tend to look at our FSZ, the FSZ enlargement, which basically predicts the progression of diabetic retinopathy. Capillary abnormalities like non-perfusion, IRMAs can be seen. Neovascularization can be picked up. You can quantify the vascular changes basically in the FSZ, the perfusion density, vascular density, avascular area, all these things can be seen. But one important thing to be noted is the changes are noted, more distorted changes of all these pathological changes are more noted in the deep capillary plexus than in the superficial capillary plexus. Rupak Kanti Biswas spoke about the OCT biomarkers. Let's look at some of the Octa biomarkers in diabetic retinopathy. The important one is the foveal avascular zone area, the contour irregularity, the average vascular vessel caliber, the vascular vessel tortuosity, as well as the vessel density. So these can be looked at as a biomarkers for the detecting the progression of the disease. Regarding the FSZ measurements, one tend to look at the area of the foveal avascular zone. Acircularity index can be noted. The perimeter, the overall diameter of the FSZ can be noted. And when you look at the vessel density in the perifoveal as well as parafoveal area, we should look at the 300 micron from within the center of the foveal avascular zone. But when you look at the FSZ measurement, it has got its own limitations. Like FSZ is variable in normals. Normative data varies from studies to studies. FSZ may be absent in some of the diabetics. Another thing is segmentation slabs of superficial capillary plexus sometimes includes a part of the deep capillary plexus, especially in the foveal region. The deep capillary plexus segmentation boundaries are not uniform in different things. The manufacturer recommend default settling likely to differ from one machine to the other machine. So these are some of the limitations of FSZ measurements by Octa. So what does the FSZ enlargement indicates? Basically, it indicates macular ischemia. Sometimes it indirectly indicates the peripheral ischemia also. The changes sometimes can be seen in diabetic patients even without the retinopathy. The FSZ changes correlates with the diabetic retinopathy severity as well as visual acuity changes. FSZ enlargement seen in both superficial capillary plexus as well as deep capillary plexus. The mean horizontal FSZ diameter and FSZ area significantly seen in the diabetic retinopathy patients compared to the healthy controls. Octa is a better predictor of FSZ changes than fluorescein angiography. When you look at the vessel density changes, especially in the perifoveal and parafoveal areas in the deep capillary plexus, this is a normal patient, this is a PDR patient. In an Octa NFAS images, you can see that they tend to decrease the vessel density, with that in turn indicates the severity of diabetic retinopathy. With using an Octa, you can do a change analysis also from one examination to another examination. If you look at you can look at the foveal avascular zone changes as well as the vessel density changes, so that it helps you to follow up the patient over a period of time to know the severity of diabetic retinopathy. Coming on to each lesion, coming on to the microaneurysms, you can know the exact depth of the microaneurysm, whether it is superficial or deep. Not all microaneurysms are seen on Octa because of the sluggish flow in these microaneurysms as well as hyporeflectivity. So thus Octa is slightly inferior to FA in detecting the microaneurysm. You can clearly see here the FFA well delineated microaneurysm seen, not so well seen in Octa. These circled things indicates the microaneurysms. You can detect the more number of microaneurysms on fundus fluorescein angiography when compared to the Octa. The next structural change is the intraretinal microvascular anomalies. These are, if you look at this, arrow indicates the IRMA. The caliber of these vessel loops are greater than that of the surrounding normal capillaries. That it helps you to differentiate the IRMA from the normal capillaries. So what is the role of Octa in diabetic macular edema? Basically, sometimes there are certain limitations can be there in imaging of Octa and DME, like segmentation artifacts can be induced by the fluid accumulation in the retina. The superficial capillary plexus parameters in DME are more reliable when compared to the deep capillary plexus. There could be an alteration of foveal avascular zone profile noted in the deep capillary plexus. Sometimes the more microaneurysms and increased foveal avascular zone area in the deep capillary plexus indicates the poor response to anti-VEGF therapy. So you can tell the patients before treatment that which are the good responders and which are the poor responders. Coming on to the next structural change, that is the distorted retinal inner layers. That's a drill. You tend to see a larger FSZ areas in eyes with the drill when compared to those who doesn't have a drill. Areas of non-perfusion and octa corresponds to the area of the drill. So the octa can correlate, has got a very good correlation with the distorted inner retinal layers. The next thing is capillary non-perfusion. Octa is definitely picks up better capillary non-perfusion areas than FFA because of the lack of leakage. The correlation of capillary non-perfusion definitely correlates with the severity of diabetic retinopathy. Next entity is a neovascularization. All epiretinal neovascularization can be seen in octa. The absence of leakage, as you've seen here, this is a neovascularization. There is extensive leakage on fluorescein angiography, but not much leakage. So you can see clearly the network of neovascularization on octa. So the absence of leakage precisely delineates this neovascular network much better. The segmentation at the vitreoretinal interface, if you can do it properly, can significantly improve the visualization of neovascularization. Neovascular changes before and after treatment can be planned with octa. Sometimes extreme peripheral neovascularization can be missed on octa, so FFA may be still needed in some of the cases. What to look for in neovascularization? You see a neovascular network, basically look at whether the neovascular network is active or inactive. Look at the greatest linear dimension of the vascular network. Look at the caliber of the vessels in the neovascularization. Look at the vessel density, flow density, perfusion density, and the flow area in the neovascularization. All these things can be graded pre and post treatment so that it gives you an indication of better follow-up in these patients. So how to know whether the neovascularization is active or inactive? The one thing we should look for in an active neovascularization is something called as exuberant vascular proliferation, or also known as EVP. As shown in this picture, the circled area indicates the presence of an EVP, that is nothing but an irregular proliferation of fine vessels. If it is present, it indicates an active neovascularization. In an inactive neovascularization, as shown in the below picture, new vessels are pruned vascular loops with the filamentous vessels, but there won't be any exuberant vascular proliferations. Even in fact, you can quantify the flow area in the NVE and NVD before and after, seen in these patients before laser treatment and after laser treatment. So you can follow up the patients very easily pre and post treatment. Easy to follow up, since it's a non-invasive thing. Most of the patients like PDR and other patients, we can detect the vascular changes even without injecting in contrast dye. So by a non-invasive method, you can easily follow up these patients. So what are the limitations of the octa? It's an evolving technology. Dynamic information like leakage is absent. So it is an advantage. Sometimes better to appreciate the capillary changes. It has got a poor axial resolution. Image acquisition area is small, so that sometimes FFA may be required for peripheral imaging. Suboptimal correction of artifacts. This is one main concern with the presence of artifacts. Difficult to develop repeatable automated segmentations. The level of lesion sometimes can be missed. May not differentiate pathological vessels from the normal vessels. Can miss areas with relatively slow blood flow like microaneurysms. So in conclusion, octa can detect the diabetic retinopathy in the subclinical stage itself, and it does not substitute fluorescein angiography. And one limitation is extreme peripheral retina sometimes may not be visualized with octa. There is a lack of leakage, so vascular network can be better appreciated. It complements the other imaging modalities. So you need other imaging modalities to come to a diagnosis. So you have to combine all the methods. We are still in the learning on how to use this octa effectively in many therapeutic decisions to come to a certain conclusion. Thank you for your patient hearing. Thank you.
The hall is open for panel discussion now.
Yeah. So now we have got 10 minutes time with us. We'll be going the discussions one by one. The first, I'll like to make a sort of a panel discussion and ask questions to the speakers. Rupak, there was a question from the audience. Rupak, is it audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, how to differentiate an ERM from a taut posterior hyaloid on an OCT?
See, the taut posterior hyaloid, usually the ERM and taut posterior, you will have, both of them are actually a disease process in the development stage. So a taut posterior hyaloid, which later on leads to epiretinal membrane. You know, the taut posterior hyaloid, this is usually there is a little gap in between the outer layer ILM and this posterior hyaloid. but ERM is usually flush to this membrane. And taut posterior hydroid that does not cause the associated changes in the retina. The ERM is usually in advanced stages. It can cause changes in the retinal architecture as well. So if you have a more of a retinal architecture change, this is more for the ERM.
Dr. Aditya is here. Dr. Aditya? Okay. Chaitra, I'll ask a question regarding you. What is the utility of ultrafluorescent angiography compared to conventional angiography? How often you use ultrafield angiography, and any specific indication you would like to do in ultrawide field angiography?
So as of now, we don't have, Sunil, we do get a lot of patients referred to us for ultrafield, but because we have the optos, it would definitely help, especially for peripheral retinal diseases, both uvea conditions, tumors. It would be a big boon, because the single most advantage of using ultra wide field is because you get the entire image at one go, and you're not losing information because you have to steer the camera as in the other devices. But of course, with Spectralis wide field, we're able to overcome a little bit of that limitation. But I think ultra wide field does have a lot of potential once we get it in more devices. As of now, I think we have it in the optos. Yeah.
The main advantages with the ultra wide field is you can avoid the montage related errors, and you can get a clear picture.
Exactly.
The other thing is now we very well know that even the central changes correlates very well with the peripheral retinal changes. If you can pick up a peripheral vascular leakage or peripheral ischemia on ultra wide field angiography, it does correlate with diabetic ischemic changes in the macular area or diabetic macular edema. So it is has got relevance in specific indications. But more and more conventional angio is fading away with the available of Octa and other things, because it is easy to follow up and it is non-invasive. So ultra wide field definitely has got a role in relevant cases.
Also, Rupak, because I think new studies have shown that many of the new literature has come out that you may miss diabetic retinopathy if you tend to look at just the posterior pole. A lot of peripheral diabetic retinopathy is also prevalent. So that's another thing that if you just keep looking at the posterior pole, we may actually miss.
Dr. Aditya is muted, I think. That's okay. Sachin, am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
The role of ultrasound, the indications, and what are the things you would like to pick up, the important things for the surgical management, especially what you would like to look for if you summarize your talk in a couple of minutes.
As I basically told earlier, this thing, when you are planning a surgery, B-scan, especially when you cannot assess the retina, B-scan has paramount importance, especially to understand how the PVD is, whether it is a broad attachment to the TRD or whether it's a focal attachment. Even in cases wherein you want to see if there is a subhyaloid hemorrhage, which would give you a clue that you have to take him for surgery, and where would you truncate your cone, and what is the extent of the TRD and the CRDs. The most important thing when we put a probe in such cases, what we would like to see is the first thing which comes to our mind is the retinal status, whether the macula is attached or macula is detached. Second thing, what we would like to see is the attachment of the vitreous. How is the vitreous attached to the retina? Then again, you will see the various other features like extent of DRD, extent of combined retinal detachment, and these things. So this is how B-scan would help us, surgical plan our surgeries.
If Aditya is there, we can ask certain questions regarding intraoperative OCT. It's an evolving technology, as we know. It has got its limitations, as well as sometimes you can get the shadowing of the instruments and other things, but definitely it helps us to image the retina intraoperatively. Vitreoretinal interface anomalies like presence of ERM, it helps in ILM peeling. All those things, many of the decisions you can make, and helps in better surgical outcome in many of the patients by using an intraoperative OCT. Uni is around here? Okay.
Sunil, we've had intraop OCT also.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please share your thoughts on that. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I thought just to complete what you said, it also helps in completion of surgery. So sometimes, you're not able to determine whether you peeled all the membranes. That's one thing that we can ensure. Second, especially in patients who've had a pre-op vitreous hemorrhage and you were not able to image very well. Once you clear out the vitreous, if you do want to look at the interface, that's one added advantage. And to pick up where you started, suppose you're redoing surgeries, like for example, macular holes, it does help to restart or reinitiate the thing. And you can actually document closure. You can document, complete peeling. But like you said, major disadvantage is the shadowing of the instruments. But I think some of the new instruments that have come in have, overcome that limitation.
Thank you for that excellent point, because the completion of surgery, we would like to know what extent you have completed the procedure, and you can get the intraoperative information there only. So Uni highlighted the choroidal thing, the very relevant things. We just, what we thought of a diabetic retinopathy is only retinal pathology. We started looking at the vitreous changes as well as the choroidal changes. The choroidal circulation changes and also in turn occurs in correlation with the retinal changes also. So choroidal imaging does have a relevance in diabetic retinopathy, especially the measurement of blood flow, thickness, aneurysms, as very well highlighted by Dr. Uni Krishnan. And anyone would like to add anything, Chaitra, regarding any of the talks or anything? We don't have any more questions from the audience. Any of the talks, if they have missed out on something and you would like to add anything on that?
I think Uni's talk was relevant because more and more we are looking at the choroid, influence on the DR. In fact, we are also looking at some more studies to look at the index, to look at how it correlates with the severity. And I think we've covered everything. And I like your talk, very well delineated. The images were excellent. I think we are moving more and more into using Octa in our practice. Even for DR, because we want to look at how well perfused the macula is or not. So I think very well done, Sunil, and it was an excellent IC. Thank you for making us part of it.
I would like to thank all the co-instructors once again for their excellent talks and the excellent inputs into this regarding imaging and diabetes, because it's a very relevant topic and it's beneficial to most of the ophthalmologists. With this, we'd like to conclude our IC, and thank you once again for all the participants, all coordinators, the AOA Scientific Committee for the opportunity, all my co-instructors. Thank you once again. Thank you one and all.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunil. I'll also thank all the other participants of this hall, Dr. Deepak, Dr. Chaitra ji, Dr. Sachin Mauli ji, and Dr. Aditya ji as well, Dr. Janshu as well, and also all the other attendees who attended this session. Thank you so much for your time. We'll conclude session 1 at Hall Helmholtz.